So Rahm Emanuel, who is the former mayor of Chicago and served as Barack Obama's chief of staff, had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently encouraging Americans to put aside their differences, stop hating each other, and focus on hating China instead. And as a piece of anti-China propaganda, it's a kind of remarkable document that he's written, because of how little evidence it presents that China is any kind of threat to the United States. So I want to just go through it and show you some of the techniques he uses for encouraging you to hate and fear China. Emmanuel's quite open about encouraging animosity towards China precisely because it would serve the domestic political purposes that he believes in, namely, in this case, tamping down left-wing and right-wing political movements that he dislikes. So the thesis of the piece is pretty well captured by the image that one of the Wall Street Journal's cartoonists has put together that features, kind of inexplicably, cartoon opossum Pogo by Walt Kelly pointing to a monstrous Chinese dragon, complete with horns and a long Fu Manchu mustache. And the Americans on the blue team are pictured pointing fingers, literally, at the Americans on the red team, and each is claiming to speak with their signs for the US, but they're oblivious to, as you can see, the enemy. The enemy being the marauding dragon that is coming for their city. Now, in case you're wondering, no, Emmanuel's actual op-ed isn't any more subtle than that. The piece is entitled, "We've Met the Enemy, and He Isn't Us." The correct enemy, of course, being China. Now, Rahm Emanuel laments that Americans are so riled up in politics, whereas we used to have, he says, a politics of politeness and respect. In the last decades, he says the country was beset by two movements defined almost exclusively by anger and resentment. Occupy Wall Street's antipathy to capitalism fixed the sentiment now driving Zohran Mamdani's campaign for New York mayor, and the Tea Party simultaneously metastasized into the MAGA movement and the riots of January 6, 2021. Now, I'm going to avoid commenting too much on the classic centrist trope here of conflating left-wing and right-wing politics as both manifestations of anger. Of course, in the left's case, that's anger that the rent is too high, people can't afford to live in this country or raise their kids, while in the right's case, it's anger at Haitians over fake stories about pet eating. But Rahm Emanuel doesn't seem to see much difference between the democratic socialism of Bernie Sanders and the authoritarian nationalism of Donald Trump. But instead, I want to focus on the bizarre but quite illuminating question that this analysis leads Rahm Emanuel to. Namely, he says, quote, "Can China be the external threat that restores internal cohesion to our politics?" Emanuel says this is the absolute perfect time for a campaign of xenophobia and warmongering against China. In case you think that's overstatement, here's the quote. "In some Shakespearean sense, China's long shadow has appeared at exactly the right moment. But Xi Jinping is much more than a foil poised to unite Americans who would otherwise remain defined by their blue and red affinities. The China threat is both real and potent. The US has never before been asked to face down a country that has 3 times our population, is fueled by an advanced economy, and is capable, as its leaders intend, of replacing us atop the global hierarchy. Failing a broad reorientation, the question won't be who lost China, but who lost to China. Yet Washington has yet to mobilize in full against a real threat." Now, Rahm Emanuel here looks back fondly at times like World War II, when he says, quote, "Nazism spurred a nation of immigrants to unite in erecting an arsenal of democracy," and the 1980s, where he says, quote, "The evil empire, as Ronald Reagan described the Soviet Union, compelled Americans of all stripes to defend the principle of freedom." But today, in the absence of anti-communist hysteria, we lack a national purpose. We can get it back, he says, if we tackle this China threat together. Now, here's what's kind of astonishing about this op-ed. At no point does Rahm Emanuel explain how China threatens America. What exactly is the China threat? What are they going to do to us? They're not actually a big red cartoon dragon with a long mustache destroying our cities. So what are they going to do? So even though Emanuel says the threat is, quote, both real and potent, he doesn't say what's actually going to happen to us if we don't mobilize in full, except that China's going to replace us atop the global hierarchy. Now there you have the basic presumption underlying a great deal of US foreign policy discourse, which is that the United States has some kind of inherent right to be the dominant global superpower forever, even if it has a much smaller population than some other countries. And any threat to our dominance over others is existential and must be stopped at all cost. And as Noam Chomsky explained in 2021,
the worst case is the increasing provocative actions towards China. That's very dangerous. By now, there's constant talk about what's called the China threat. You even read it in sober, reasonable, usually reasonable journals about the terrible China threat. Well, what is, and we have to move expeditiously to contain and limit the China threat. Now, what exactly is the China threat? Actually, that question is rarely raised here. It is discussed in Australia, the country that's right in the claws of the dragon. So recently, the distinguished statesman, former Prime Minister Paul Keating, did have an essay in the Australian press about the China threat. He finally concluded, realistically, that the China threat is China's existence. The U.S. will not tolerate the existence of a state that cannot be intimidated the way Europe can be, that does not follow U.S. orders the way Europe does, but pursues its own course. That's the threat.
Emanuel seems to confirm Chomsky's analysis there, because there's no actual threat to the American people here. He doesn't really pretend there's one. He doesn't list one. There's just a threat to the relative global economic power of American elites. But most of us have nothing to fear from China, and China itself, interestingly, if you pay attention to statements that their government is putting out, is always pleading with the US not to engage in this kind of Cold War rhetoric. The Chinese government has warned over and over again that this kind of zero-sum thinking leads to unnecessary and avoidable conflict. But a new Cold War is precisely what Rahm Emanuel is advocating. Nowhere in his op-ed does he talk about humanizing, empathizing with, or cooperating with China. They're just a convenient boogeyman, a cartoon red dragon, to be feared and to be fought. Now, the dangers of this kind of thinking can't be overstated. Chomsky and I warned in this book, The Myth of American Idealism, that the very survival of humanity depends on the US managing to coexist peacefully with China rather than end up in a state of war with a large nuclear armed power. This kind of rhetoric about China as an enemy is ubiquitous on the right, but Rahm Emanuel is showing here that it's no better among many centrist Democrats who don't seem to have any understanding of the long-term risks of nuclear conflict or the suicidal stupidity of turning our top overseas trading partner into an enemy. Emanuel also repeats the annoying habit of some Democrats of attacking Trump from the right on China, saying that Trump's efforts to compete with China are emulating Beijing's state-directed economic model rather than encouraging the dynamism of the private sector, in a strange effort to brand the Democrats as more capitalist than Trump. Now, Rahm Emanuel might run for president in 2028. He's an egomaniac. He's expressed some interest. And while I would hope that his infamously abrasive personality and the ignominious end to his tenure as Chicago mayor will make him deeply unpopular, right now the field is wide open. And if it's not Emanuel, we may still get one of these pro-corporate warmongers as the Democratic candidate. And that would be a tragedy because these people are in many ways not meaningfully different than Donald Trump on foreign policy. Emanuel's ignorant statements about Occupy Wall Street and Zoran Mamdani show he has no understanding of the importance of addressing inequality, and his op-ed here shows that he's planning a brazen effort to manufacture a fake enemy in order to deflect popular anger away from where it should be directed, which is straight at the American ruling class that he represents. For actual sensible analysis, you can pick up, instead of the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, a copy of Beautiful Current Affairs magazine. It's released 6 times a year in print. It's available at currentaffairs.org/subscribe. It's full of beautiful art, games, puzzles, comics, satirical advertisements, insightful and illuminating essays on topics of major importance, and it's all written with a bit of flair and a sense of humor. Stick it on your coffee table today. Subscribe to Current Affairs, currentaffairs.org/subscribe. We're also a 501c3 organization. We have no advertisers. We have no corporate backers, so you can make a donation to Current Affairs that's tax deductible to the extent allowable by law by going to currentaffairs.org/donate today. Thanks for listening.